I'm joined here on the panel by Jean Wilhoit, who's the Executive Director of the Council of Chief State School Officers, Mike Petrilli at the Fordham Foundation, and Janet Barresi from the State Superintendent in Oklahoma, and Robert Hammond, who is the Commissioner of Education in Colorado. You'll note from your agenda that the title of this session is State Leadership in Accountability. It's worth taking just a moment, right, to recognize that this may be the first time in history we could have had a session with this title. And I mean that quite seriously. If you look at the history of accountability in education, back in 1985, right, at the National Governors Association, Lamar Alexander and a group of governors put out a report called Time for Results, challenging states to focus on results as the centerpiece of their accountability system. That's when states began to work in a serious way on these issues. At that point in time, I worked at NGA, we did a survey of states. There were 6 states that had some provision in their law that allowed them to intervene in a low-performing district or a low-performing school. 6 out of 50. Fast forward to 1999, I worked in the Clinton administration then. We had just proposed what we thought were tough new accountability measures for ESEA reauthorization. And the president was having a meeting with the National Governors Association. So we had all 50 governors at the White House, and the topic was education. And he was going to be explaining his reauthorization proposal. And we were expecting pushback from the governors on what were then more forceful requirements for accountability. So I did a little research for him to prepare him and found out that in 1999, there were now 19 states that had some authority to intervene in low-performing districts or schools. So in the space of 13 years, from 1986 to 1999, 1 state per year gave itself the authority to intervene in low-performing schools. And the president explained to governors that if we kept going at that pace, right, it would be decades before we had really tough-minded accountability in the country. Turns out the governors were okay with that. The Congress, however, was not okay with the Clinton administration's proposal. And so in 2001, we got No Child Left Behind, which certainly had a forceful federal role on accountability and has played a huge role in basically shaping, if not defining, state accountability systems. That's why it's unusual, right, that today we can be having a conversation about state leadership on accountability. The 2001 requirements of No Child Left Behind came about largely because Congress was convinced that there was no state leadership on accountability, and so the federal government needed to take that role. We're at a moment now where I think everyone has recognized that the requirements of No Child Left Behind, the AYP requirements, are not workable. A number of organizations and individuals have been thinking about what a new set of accountability requirements in ESEA would be. In a moment, we're going to hear Jean talk about the CCSSO principles, which I think are getting a lot of traction in the states and as an example of state leadership. It's possible to have state leadership in this area because of the previous leadership that states have provided, particularly thanks to Jean on the Common Core standards. That is a sea change on this set of issues. So we're really at a really critical and important moment here to talk about what states can do in the context of more state leadership on accountability. We'll hear about ESEA proposals, but we all know that those aren't going very far, very fast. And so there's a new opportunity on the table for state leadership, which is basically request waivers from No Child Left Behind so that states can fashion their own accountability systems and have, with all due respect, have the federal government step out of the way a bit. So this is the context in which we are having this conversation. I've asked Jean to briefly describe the principles that came out of the work of a CCSSO task force. I've asked Mike to offer his thoughts on what the right federal role in an ESEA role for accountability ought to be. And then I've asked Janet and Robert to talk about what they see the principles for a state accountability system ought to be. And since they're both working on waiver requests, to the extent that they've been able to figure this out, what is it they need waived so that they can do what they think is right for their state? And what might they be prepared to give back to the federal government in exchange for that waiver? So that's sort of the shape that this conversation is going to take. And we have a hard stop at 2:15 because a number of you will be then you'll either be going home or you're going to be transitioning to the Park Institute, which starts 45 minutes later. So we're going to stay right on track here because we've got a lot to get done here and a lot to start next. So without further ado, Gene.
Thanks, Mike. My role here is sort of set the context for this movement of states in the last 2 to 3 years. And toward that end, let me just say that I think you have to make some assumptions about the world being different today than it was a few years ago. Some of us have exerted some leadership from a state perspective. I think even though that leadership has been exerted, there are still some doubts about whether the states are at a point where they're willing to move ahead. And so I think Mike's comment earlier about what are we willing to promise the feds in this compact that's coming is very important. This is not an attempt to relieve states from accountability, but it's to redesign the accountability structure that we're talking about. Although we have encoded college and career ready standards in the states, and we've made official a promise that we've talked about for the last 20, 30 years, we're in a highly vulnerable time. We're still hearing loud voices to relieve us from accountability. And the worst thing we could do in this environment is to back away. And the state is the responsible agent to make sure that we don't and are not even interpreted in any circle as attempting to waive accountability. In fact, I think what you'll see as we move ahead is that this is a higher degree of accountability, but a fair degree of accountability than what we've had in place under the current contract between the federal government and the states. So we've been about business here for a while. Last 3 years, literally, in an intense conversation among the states about what is our rightful responsibility to show leadership in this kind of environment. You can't sit back and complain and argue, accuse the current law of being inadequate or out of alignment. We know it's losing credibility in the field, but that's one set of comments that you could make. It's our responsibility, we think, to step forward. And I think building off of this commitment that's been made, and I thank Mike for and Achieve for the strong leadership role they played in the helping develop the Common Core. But that's no small task. For the first time in our history, the states have come to agreement about a common definition, but it is not common in terms of its interpretation. This college and career ready goal is a serious goal that we've taken on. It ought to and has to become the benchmark for what we do in the future. We can't put that out there and say this is aspirational and not begin to build accountability systems around it. And to do so brings consistency across the system that we've not had at this point, but it also brings a higher bar for all of us to move toward. So all this says is we had a lot of people spend a lot of time doing a lot of energy work around this. So this is an intense effort that's come. I gave a couple of chiefs at this meeting, Mitchell and I guess Tony are both members of this committee, but we had intense debates about what is the leadership role that states ought to assume. We produced 3 documents. These are available to anyone right now. We've made them available to the states. But the premise here is it possible for states to come together around a set of principles that we can agree upon? Not that we would all implement these principles in identical ways. In fact, the idea would be that each state would implement these principles in a context with a history and a set of desires that they have in their state, but remain attached to and committed to a set of principles. We've given the states a roadmap that details those principles in what we think are open, honest, and fair ways. And I think in a way that says to the states, this is a very serious business. If you're going to take this on, it's going to require greater accountability than what we've had in the past. And we've even begun to draft some federal legislation that nobody's paying attention to right now. But this list is really where we're going. And I would just say very quickly that there are 4 general changes here that we would see in the accountability system. And what you have to do is forget AYP, forget the current calculus around which people are being held accountable, and step back. And remember, the one big flaw in No Child Left Behind was it was loose on goals. Because we have states now that have set very low bars and are reporting very high success levels that are not aligned with college and career ready standards. We have other states that have been more rigorous. And in effect, the schools that are the states that have identified higher levels of expectations have the highest numbers of schools not making AYP. So the states that were sincere and aggressive in their first attempts to identify high standards are the ones that are now receiving the greatest punishment from the current contract. So, thanks for trying. And so what we wanted to do was correct this issue and say to the states, are you willing to commit to a set of standards that are rigorous, that are very focused and identifiable in at least 2 content areas, English language arts and mathematics, that you would sign on to as the aspirational goals for your state. And we've done that. So that's the big shift. And what we're saying here is any federal compact between the states and the federal government in the future ought to be anchored in that. Every state is shooting toward college and career ready standards. Second thing we've done is begin to talk about a new kind of relationship. You can't set a common means of achieving these goals across all the states in a very standardized way and expect to reach excellence. So we're going to have to set some very strict requirements, but we're going to have to allow innovation and in fact expect and encourage innovation in states and learning from research as we move together. So this set of standards pushes us toward that kind of contractual relationship. We learn as we go. We set very different kinds of expectations, not in terms of what student outcomes would be, but how we would get there. We would treat the districts very differently than we have in the past. We would hold on to, thirdly, some of the aspects of No Child Left Behind that have done some have provided positive benefits. The fact that we have to report on a continuous basis, on an annual basis about schools, district, and state progress is important, and we need to continue that. We need to keep the lens on. We need much more transparent. We need to hold on to and increase the transparency of reporting of results that we've had under No Child Left Behind. We need to disaggregate the information that we have between schools, districts, subpopulations of students in those systems and make that very apparent and set our goals against those achievements. And we need to build into the system a couple of dramatic improvements. One, this is not only a status reporting, that is, you pass or fail based on the level of achievement against a standard set of achievement goals across the state in a single year. That's the system we have in place. We have to factor growth into this, growth towards status though. It's not enough statine growth was the old formula we had for Title I. We don't want to go back to those years because you get differentiated expectations for students. All students reaching high goals with aggressive goals for those students that are far behind, with improvement status being directed to all the states. So you get a combined kind of accountability system that factors in both growth and status. Secondly, we think that there are ways to measure success that include other factors that might be important to drive the system forward. You need to begin to think about ways to put into the system a formula in your state that causes behaviors to advance to a higher level. A single score on an end-of-year test by the state, conducted by the state, is not a very high driver of improvement. But if you begin to factor in other kinds of elements that are important to the system, movement toward higher education, success to the sophomore level in the high school, are other indicators that are important to begin to build in the system, and it's very supportive of the agenda you've been talking around through Achieve in the last few years. How do you tie those two systems together through accountability systems? So what we're going to see are systems that have many more factors in measuring that student success than what we have. And then finally, it's not enough to measure success or failure. We're going to have to provide much more support. And I think one of the quid pro quo agreements that the states are now ready to step up and take on is that if we identify schools, it is our responsibility to intervene in those schools and provide direct guidance. We may not be able to do it, and this is going to put tremendous pressure on your state education agencies for their own capacity to do this. We're going to have to think about capacity very differently than we have right now. What's the total ability of folks in the state to aggregate resources around students and around schools that are not successful? And we're going to take on the low-performing schools aggressively, but we think the real goal here for a state is that every school is on a continuous improvement pathway. There shouldn't be a point at which you back off and relieve yourself of responsibility. High-achieving schools need to set goals against their deficits to learning. So that's where we are. And again, Mike said implications for ESEA. Basically, the message here is we did this with the hope that there would be some reauthorization this year. Remember, we started this 3 years ago. But in light of that not happening, we can't afford, if it doesn't happen this year, or do you have any hope it's going to happen next year in that election year? And can the states wait 3 more years before we begin to do something about this? We cannot. So we've got to take some leadership. We're beginning to put a lot of energy, a lot of effort into working through the waiver process with the Secretary, knowing that that is a short-term solution, but it does provide an avenue for us not to continue this conversation of wanting. We have about a dozen states now that have submitted for waivers to help us get out of our current accountability system. We cannot do that, folks. This is not about getting out of accountability. We've got to be more constructive as we move forward. So, Mike.
Gene, thank you very much. It's a sort of a comprehensive picture. I think it's the right set of principles on which to move forward. I guess it's you're in the unusual position of having your reauthorization proposal ready maybe 3 or 4 years in advance.
We're well prepared.
So it's another example of state leadership. But Mike, you have been paying very careful attention to ESEA implementation, to ESEA reauthorization around these
For a
issues.
long time now.
Yes, for a long time. And you haven't gotten it done either.
Yes, I have not.
But your observations on this, please.
Right, I think the only people who benefit from this lack of reauthorization are us bloggers who can continue writing about No Child Left Behind for the foreseeable future. Hi, it's good to be here. First of all, thank you, Mike, for the invitation. I think it was about 3 years ago that I was last at an ADP state team meeting, and I believe we were talking about this crazy notion that maybe we could have common standards in English and math and how quickly things moved. Just to say that, thanks to Gene's leadership and Mike's leadership, as well as Dane and NGA and many others, that it's pretty remarkable what's been accomplished in that short amount of time. And I know now you all are very focused on the real work of implementing these standards. I'm at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. We are an education policy think tank, generally considered right of center. And we spend a lot of our time these days defending this idea of common standards from our friends on the right, who still very strongly believe that this is a terrible idea, and that this is a federal plot to take over the schools. And we spend the rest of our time trying to convince our friends in the Department of Education, Arnie Duncan and his team, not to make this a federal plot to take over the schools and to feed those fears. And so it's in that context that I come to you today. Gene said that the world is very different today. That is true, and I thought he was going to go in one direction. He didn't. I'll go there. It's very different politically today. This movement is very fragile politically as we enter a general election campaign that very may well pit the governor of Texas against the incumbent president. Governor of Texas, who's made a big issue out of saying no to race to the top, saying no to Common Core, and saying no to Washington overreaching. And for those of us on the right who pay attention to what the conservative world thinks and talks about, you see people already talking about Obamacare, the jobs bill that failed, and now national standards as sort of a litany of examples of overreach from the federal government. And so this is fragile indeed. And so we're very worried about anything that contributes to that storyline that the Department of Education is trying to drive this national standards effort. It really has been a state-led thing. It needs to stay state-led. And so that's why I'm very worried about these waivers. We've been quite vocal about any hint that states would have to sign on to the Common Core in order to get a waiver. And I am hoping and praying that the language, when it comes out in a few weeks, next month, whenever we expect it, will make it very clear that that's not the case and that a state like Virginia can, quite constructively and hopefully relatively easily demonstrate that they have high standards too and should not be held up. But that could become a big political issue. When we talk about ESEA reauthorization, it's not happening next year. It almost for sure isn't happening next year. We're talking 2013. And you still don't see a clear roadmap about how this thing gets done because the opinions in Congress are so strongly divided. And when you talk to people on the Republican side of the aisle, just the way that Mike framed this, if I can excuse you, Mike, we talked about what accountability requirements will be in the law.
If any.
If any, okay. That frame, accountability requirements, I think will make a lot of Republicans shudder. And of course, they control the House. They could very well control the Senate after 2012. My hope, and I guess what we've been trying to encourage, is at the federal level, not necessarily the state level, but at the federal level, that we stop talking about accountability and we talk about transparency instead. And that isn't backing away, that isn't giving up, that is just a recognition of the limitation of the federal role. The ironic thing about results-based reform when it's come from the federal level is that, of course, the federal government is 3 or 4 steps removed from the classroom. And so all they can try to do is get states to agree to put accountability systems in place. But then you're back to the same old federal-state compliance model. Are the states complying with federal requirements to have this system that's supposed to no longer focus on compliance but focus on results? And there's no easy way to solve that conundrum, that the federal government, as long as it doesn't control the schools, and it shouldn't, is going to be in that situation. So if there's going to be compliance requirements, let's ask the states to comply with things that the federal government could actually do something about, could actually enforce. And from our way of thinking, that is more around making sure that results are transparent. Okay, so particularly since so many states have signed on to these college and career ready standards, these common standards, assuming the consortia do a good job with the assessments, set high cut scores, big assumptions, but we're counting on you, Mike.
We got it covered.
All right. Then we will have solved this problem of low expectations and varying expectations. At that point, there's all kinds of possibilities about having a huge amount of data out there in the public domain about how schools are performing, sliced and diced a million different ways. And the federal concern should be, do we have data that we can trust? And the states then, if the states want to, they can then take all the slicing and dicing with their own formulas and come up with judgments about schools. But other people could too. Education Trust could put out a national rating of all the schools in the country, at least in Common Core states, and how well they're doing at closing the achievement gap. GreatSchools.net, that already has its rating, which is a status-based rating. Okay, we should call this richschools.net, because if you want to get a 10, you basically have to be in an affluent suburb. I'll let that sit there. That they could be a much more nuanced view. And so all these debates we have about, how do we define a good school? How do we define a bad school? Which schools are eligible for intervention and which are not? I think the federal government's role should be, hey, make sure the data is out there in different groups, including the states, but not just the states, can come to their own judgments and inform the public, inform policymakers, et cetera. I think that something like that, a focus on transparency rather than accountability, is something you might get Republicans to sign on to. But I think it's going to continue, if we continue to think about accountability in the same way, which is we're going to have a law and we're going to require states to sign on to a bunch of requirements, and we're going to tweak them, and we're not going to make the same mistakes we made last time, but we're going to make new mistakes, and we're going to do it a little bit differently. I don't see that really flying, particularly in this political environment where there's just such a strong anti-Washington sentiment. So the transparency piece, I think, is key. And then it's up to the states and state leadership to say, okay, the federal government may not require us to do all these things, but we're going to do them anyways, and we're going to decide, state by state, how much of the focus is going to be on the lowest performing schools, to what degree do we want to push the high achievers, et cetera, et cetera. The federal role, though, is met, because in return for all of our money, we have good data about results, and I would throw in there asking for good data about about spending. And if you really had nationwide comparable data on how are schools performing and how much are they spending at a school level, which nobody knows today, right? Nobody knows how much their local school spends. We don't have a clue, right? If you had those two pieces of information, that could be transformative. And I think Uncle Sam could feel like, okay, I've done what I need to do for the next 10 years. Am I optimistic? Not necessarily, but if we don't come to something like that, I think the reauthorization may never happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Well, Janet, welcome to Washington. You've just gotten, I think, a really good snapshot, description of where things stand around ESEA and federal accountability provisions now and where they might go in the future. What's a chief to do, right? Particularly sitting there with an opportunity from the secretary, right, to seek waivers from some of the ESEA requirements that would enable you to fashion a system that works better for Oklahoma. How do you approach this? How do you think about it?
And a chief that's been in office just since January. Welcome to the real
By the way,
world.
you're senior compared to Robert Hammond, who we'll hear from
That's
next.
true. That's true. I've forgotten. Robert's only been there for a few months. I think it's important then to bring this down from a national level down to the state level. And indeed, building upon the good work at CCSSO and other constituent organizations. I'm also privileged to be a part of Chiefs for Change, who have also been a part of this conversation going forward. Working under the watchful eye of Fordham Foundation and being from the reddest state in the country and understanding the political realities of that. How do you work with all that? How do you negotiate that as a state chief? Well, you focus on the kids and you start looking on what is best for the children of your state. And so as I came into office, we reorganized the department, and I introduced the 3 R's to rethink, restructure, and reform education in the state of Oklahoma. And as we reorganized the department, we organized around 3 core principles. And the first one is focused around literacy for reading and numeracy, STEM initiatives, but they were all focused around college, career, and citizen ready of all of our students in the state to be proficient. As I began and continued my work with Chiefs for Change, all of us got together and did begin our discussions around waiver requests. And actually, I'm wondering if those of us from states might consider less of a waiver request and more of building a blueprint for reauthorization of ESEA, one that can serve as a model possibly, or a framework for Congress when they do take up this authorization in a serious way. Let's us be proactive. Let's show them what we can do. And I think if we begin to think about this in that way, I think it will help frame our conversation. So what we did is we began to talk about 6 specific areas that we wanted to look at in terms of our performance and how we're going to frame that around our state's waiver request. And certainly our state is focused on rigorous standards and our assessments. We are a governing member of PARC, and our state is beginning its effort at transitioning to the Common Core. And I will tell you, all the discussions over the last couple of days have just been absolutely so very helpful along those lines, and I very much appreciate them. We're also working very diligently with higher ed and our career tech system. In terms of higher ed, we are focused with them on using these assessments for placement in colleges. And then we're also working on other strategies on how to involve higher ed, specifically in the classroom level and with teachers. Again, with that focus of making our students college and career ready. We're looking then at using a robust student data system and really using it as a tool in so many different ways. And in terms of identifying schools for intervention. So we will be identifying the lowest 5%, lowest performing schools in that low 5% category. But may I also say, identifying those highest 5% of performing schools. And using a new accountability system that is based on a grading system of A through F that uses multiple metrics, not just test measurements, but multiple metrics, a desire to increase that level of transparency, but then just as importantly, to increase the level of parent and community involvement in schools, getting everybody on the same page at talking about what we need to do, what is best for students. Then applying an aggressive and a differentiated intervention model into those schools. So on those schools that are receiving an F and have been low performing for a long time, because if you're in a D or an F school, it's kind of hard to be college and career and citizen ready. So through state-guided restructuring of that school or state-guided a takeover by possibly an EMO or conversion to a charter, helping them go through a process. The way they would get out of this is by 2 years, giving them 2 years to go from an F to a C, but at the same time also making sure that they're increasing their reading scores and reading proficiency. Again, also our work with SIG schools would also be folded into this, and that would be continuous and ongoing. For those highest performing districts, remove a lot of regulations, allow them more autonomy, and then hold them up as a model, asking them whenever possible to work with those lowest performing schools or even the middle performing schools at helping them to become better. We are developing a very effective teacher and leader effectiveness system that folds into this. That's what's so very important. Is our teacher and leader effectiveness system. In our state, we are now defining what effective teaching is. And we are folding that in with our data system and effective practices within our classrooms. We are bringing the data down to the student level. And instead of just saying, all right, X school, you have to be better, at actually getting down to the classroom level and in saying, in order to meet these goals, in order to meet these important goals for improvement, it doesn't mean you just got to do a better job of teaching. It perhaps means in terms of teacher and leader effectiveness that your teacher possibly doesn't pause long enough after asking a question, so give an instruction to do that, and to improve their teaching practices, and then identifying exactly how many students per year you have to get to that goal line of improvement in order to get there. So being very specific, drilling down to the student level, and then drilling down to the teacher level. Provide clear and thorough parent and community involvement, as we said. That's a very important component, and possibly even entertaining the idea of a parent trigger in those chronically failing schools, where parents can go in and be a big part of the renewal of that school or the reopening of that school. The remaining areas have to do with funding. The funding needs to start becoming more student-based and less program-based. And it should be evaluated in that way, and it should be reported out in that way. We, again, as Mike said, in all areas, transparency is absolutely critical. And in terms of funding, it's even, that is one big area where it is highlighted. For that, we need greater flexibility. The use of federal funds, and for that matter, state funds that come down, have to be increased in terms of flexibility. Professional development needs to be related directly towards improving practice within the classroom. It must underpin those areas where gaps are identified in states and be targeted in those areas. How are you going to know 3 years out when you apply for a federal grant that you're going to have a specific need for federal dollars in a certain area in year 2 or 3 of your grant? We must be given the ability to have flexibility to take those dollars and to appropriately apply them, not just on a state level, but right down into the classroom level. We think that is very important. And then in the area of reporting, we have to align our fiscal reporting for state and federal dollars to our growth model. So we're asking that in order to be relieved from AYP, in order to be given this increased flexibility of spending federal dollars, we're willing to stand up and show taxpayers their return on their investment. Those are some of the highlights of what we're looking at as a state. We are looking to involve all of our partners on that, superintendents, teachers, principals, and all of our other groups as we move forward on this.
Thank you. That was a very clear and detailed picture of where you are going. That's quite impressive. Thank you. Robert Hammond, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. That's terrific.
Too loud?
No, just fine. So please, you've been able to listen to this conversation, and you've been working on these issues literally up to the minute in your in Colorado. Paint the picture for us about how you see steering Colorado through this set of accountability issues.
Well, first, thank you for allowing me to do this. What we're struggling with today and as many of you have been through this before, is presenting your budget to the governor's office in our state and going over what we need specifically around our accountability systems and our assessments, as well as educator effectiveness on our continued funding. So that is obviously this afternoon and has high priority with me. So I hope you would understand me not being able to be there and also doing something unusual doing this. So thank you very much, Mike.
You're welcome.
What I'd first like to say, I do want to thank Dean and for all the work that CCSS is always doing in providing the guidance. We're fully in support of that as a state, and that's helped drive our thinking as we look at what we're doing. What I really wanted, I guess, in some of the questions that you posed earlier, of how we're approaching this as a state, I think it needs to be in the context, and Janet, you did a great job, and it's been nice seeing you in our state. So we framed everything around the department. Originally, I think, let me go back a bit. We've been in a mode the last 3 years at the department of forward thinking, and otherwise putting a lot of strategies in place and starting to act upon those strategies. What's happening to us now, where I view it, is we're now in the phase of doing, which is probably the most challenging thing that I've been through in my career, both in education and the other fields that I've been a part of. But it's full implementation of everything that we've talked about, especially in a time of diminishing resources. And I think, Mike, you could not have said it better, in a time of, quite frankly, where the political landscape is varied and poses some challenges on both sides of the fence. So with that in mind, one of the things I want to talk about, I think you asked, Mike, as part of this, that what needs to change in our accountability systems to reflect the goal of college and career readiness. Really, everything that we're doing in Colorado is around the centerpiece of all kids need to be college and career ready. That's been the foundational piece. What we have done as a state, we've organized everything around our priority areas, which is our standards. I think, as you know, in Colorado, we have adopted new standards that all districts must meet or exceed by December of this year. We're now in the process of discussion of our new assessment system. We've gone through a full 1.5 year process of determining the attributes of that new system. And I have to say we've worked very closely with higher ed on everything that we're doing. But we're now in the process of assigning from those standards. We know what our new assessment system should look like, and now we know what that would cost, and also how we can use the consortium as a part of reducing those costs. So we're discussing that with our board, as well as how do we get some of the things that aren't covered, and particularly by the consortium, that our state needs to consider. Again, that's on this afternoon. So that's happening as we speak, and we're talking with our board about that. Also, our entire accountability system has changed in Colorado a couple of years ago, and we have what we feel a very robust accountability system. You can find that on our net if you go to the Colorado Department of Education, but it's really advanced everything that we're doing, because we're really looking at this whole package as a system. And I have to mention that our educator effectiveness work, we're now in the process of developing the rules and doing the pilot for among several districts in our state. We've got engaged to participate in that funding. So we're well on our way to what we believe is a very effective educator effectiveness system for our state. And finally, what we're trying to do in innovation and choice and wrap around all of those models and expanded learning opportunities around everything that we're talking about. But as it comes to the waiver process, you know, it goes back to the question I think you asked before, what do we need to change? In our opinion, in Colorado, we don't need to change anything. We believe we have all the right ingredients to have a very aggressive reform agenda and to see improvements in our school district and our schools. We feel very comfortable about where we're going. That doesn't mean that we need to improve and change as we go forth. But our biggest challenge right now is implementing all the things that we have on our plate and doing that well. What we do believe needs to change, and I'm fully supportive of this, is that we do need to apply for a waiver, because what we have now in Colorado is two distinctly different accountability systems. And as we really focus on our own accountability system, through use of our growth model and other criteria that all feed in what you'll hear the term in Colorado, our performance framework. That's a model that we established over a year ago. We've been through 1 year of it already. That really is our basis for accrediting all the school districts. And it's really based around the 4 factors, specifically in high school, about academic achievement, academic growth gaps, and most importantly, post-secondary and workforce readiness. So those 4 factors make up our performance framework and how we look and view at every particular school. And as a part of our system, our state accountability system, what we've done, we've tried to design it with a singular vision that we want every student on track to proficiency by the 10th grade and college and career ready by exit. And so what we feel causes confusion in that whole process is how AYP factors into basically you either meet or you don't meet the criteria. One of the other questions that you asked that we consider, in what context, if anything, do we need the Department of Education to waive in order to realize what our vision is for a singular accountability system? I have to tell you, the process of talking about a waiver is somewhat political, and again, I found the comments that Mike said interesting because it applies to our state as well. But what we're really trying to talk about in Colorado is, as we look about our public, our parents, our taxpayers get confused with AYP versus the Colorado accountability system and how we talk about it. And we also find that districts and schools, as you might suspect, are not paying a lot of attention to AYP because we want them to pay attention to what we're doing in our accreditation system. So that's really key to us, and what we're looking at is to really expand. I think we've come across some unique concepts that we're going to be talking more with our board about next week, is to really expand the use of school improvement resources, Title I in particular, through set-asides for supplemental services and transportation to all schools that would be needed assistance as identified by our state system, regardless of Title I designation. That's a bit different. And what I hear from others is the real need to waive supplemental services as well as the transportation requirements. We believe that, and especially with the discussions with our board, we're not ready to do that at the state. We believe that that is important, especially for the parents and the citizens in our community, that they still have that option of choice. What we've also gone through is very detailed analysis of our system as compared with AYP, and that's part of our discussions with the board. If we're asking for a waiver from AYP, I think it's incumbent upon us to actually prove that our system is more rigorous than AYP. The interesting thing, and as we've gone through this analysis, that we actually will, as of now, have 100 net schools that will be served that are not being served now, that we can offer services to if approved through this waiver. And some of those are not Title I schools. The interesting thing, that will be, I think, interesting as we approach this, as we actually try to expand services. We're really looking around 5 areas of waiver. Really, obviously, it's jettisoning No Child Left Behind, adequate yearly progress, and of course, replace it with the school and district performance frameworks in our state. But we're also looking at replacing Title III, the annual, the AMAOs, the annual measurable achievement objectives with better state measures we feel we have of progress toward English language attainment. We're also looking at replacing NCLB school and district improvement consequences and the timelines with our state accreditation rules. That would be obvious. We're also talking about targeting NCLB school improvement resources on school and districts identified by the state as among the lowest performing 15%. That, I think, If the department really walks their talk, I think why not? And that makes a lot of sense to us, even if they're not Title I schools. We're also talking about using Title II funds in support of the development and implementation of our educator evaluation system. So those are the things we're looking at as a state if we pursue a waiver. And again, based on the evidence that we have at hand, we believe we have sound reasoning for what we're asking. And once we get that package done, team, it's our desire to also review that with your organization, and then we're going to come out and talk with the Department of Education. Again, that's all predicated based on our board approving this request. And I know we haven't seen the guidelines, and we're anxious to see that. But part of us, if our board reviews and approves off on this, we want to go out and talk with you, as well as start meeting with the department on this.
Thank you, Robert.
So that's kind of where we're at as a state, and what we believe, and I couldn't agree with Janet more, we need to see more flexibility. We know, especially those districts that we're seeing better performance at, they need to be relieved of a lot of rules, and that's why we have a lot of waivers in progress, or the criteria for that in our state. So anyway, that kind of gives you a flavor. I hope others may have questions, but what we're doing in the state.
Robert, thank you very much. That was, again, a very sort of thorough, very detailed description. And I think what it does, both Robert's comments and Janet's comments suggest two things. One is states are thinking really hard about this. This is not something that states are taking lightly. And I was particularly struck by Robert's comments. If you think about states that have for a long time been operating two accountability systems, a state design system and NCLB, in some sense, the waiver request is pretty simple. Just throw out the AYP requirements and let the state operate its own. Mike, in that sense, it sounds to me like it's an example of what you'd expect to happen should the Congress take up your proposal. So we're actually beginning to see what this would look like in reality. So we've had 4 really good presentations. We have a bit of time left, and people have been listening and absorbing all of this. And I think I want to move right to the audience and see if any of you have any questions or comments or thoughts that you want to share on this set of issues. I know many of you have to be thinking about these same issues in your own states. Give you a second to think about this.
Georgia's doing some.
Martha from Georgia, and then we have a mic here.
It's coming.
So the mic is coming here, and then we'll go over there for the next one.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Just a comment that this presentation has really been helpful. I have just added sentences to our waiver application after listening to you. And that's the truth. Well done for all 4 of you. We really enjoyed it.
Good. Anyone else writing now? Yeah.
Okay, Mike, quick question for any panelist. As you're moving through it, we're expecting big things. What is describe your communication program and the public metrics that you'll use for people to track it?
So, let me turn first to Janet and Robert to that. I assume that this is really focused on how would you do this? How would you talk about this in states, and what would you communicate to parents and the public?
That's a tremendous question, and we have begun a purposeful discussion of that in the department. First of all, in terms of reaching educators and all of our partners in the education community, we have begun discussions with rural and urban and suburban districts through a network we're calling the REACH network. And this is a systematic way of disseminating information on all of the areas, first of all, Common Core transition, but then also on these reforms, and then an opportunity to provide information, but also get feedback from them in these areas. But you're exactly right. It's going to take a multi-tiered approach as we begin to visit with parents. I've already begun discussions with our PTA groups and the head of our PTA groups on their dissemination of information regarding this. We don't want to just give them information. We want to listen back. you know, possibly even public service announcements. We've had some folks step up and want to become involved in that. There won't be any one way. We'll probably identify 25 to 30 different methods and platforms that we'll need as we go out to make Oklahomans aware of the significance of this, what we're doing, and why we're doing it.
And with that, what about metrics that people can follow and track and see whether we're gaining any ground?
That's really important, and that's part of the reasoning about why we're installing the A through F grading system. It is a system, when you look at it, that's ultimately very fair, but then also gets everyone on the same level of talking about improvement, of understanding it at all levels, all folks that are involved in this, and we think that's very important as well.
Just a couple of additional comments on this. As you know now, we have some tools available to us in reporting that we haven't had historically. Every state now has an ability to aggregate data down to the student level. So we have student level identifiers in every state, but one right now. And now that brings some capacity to this that we've not had in the past to learn some things that from our work. I expect all the states will move away from a single indicator or single method of identification of a single assessment to a variety of what that state determines to be success indicators. And those success indicators, and I think Robert mentioned in his, he had both academic real performance against status, he had growth, he had college and career ready success indicators, and he had some criteria around gaps, performance and gaps. And I would expect that all states then inside the states are going to be much more transparent about laying that out in some way that citizens not only can see what we're reporting, but sort of getting to what Mike was saying, that is allow others to take those data and try to make sense out of them, make that open and transparent so that people can manipulate those data and work with them in a way that makes sense to them, issue reports against it. We've got to encourage this kind of environment where people are constantly looking at, struggling with a rich array of information that we don't now have. It's coming quickly. The second development on it is that in November, we'll have states agreeing to common education data standards. First time. So I think the states are figuring out that it is good to begin to talk to each other in ways that make sense. Right now, you can't do that. You can't make comparison across the states because we're all using different definitions, different data standards, different sort of reporting timelines and so forth. And now the states are in a process of moving towards some sort of commonality across those reportings so that we'll, for the first time, begin to have cross-state kinds of capacities that we've not had in the past. I think all of that means people are going to have ability to understand more information in front of them, more ways not only to digest what's coming at them, but also get engaged in trying to figure this out.
Thank you, Gene. We've got time for just a couple more questions. I see Todd over here has one, and then back to Martha.
You want me to go ahead and add in a comment?
Sure, a brief comment, please, Robert.
Yeah, I would encourage you, if you haven't looked at it, we have a portal that we've used for the last 3 years called SchoolView, that we put all of our results by schools on that, from the progress on growth status for gaps, their college and career readiness status, et cetera, including our unified improvement plans that are now required for each and every school. We've tried to make that a very transparent system because we've got tremendous feedback from parents as well as the public about how they are able to go in there and evaluate and look at the performance of the school and how that actually has driven the conversations at the school level like never before. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Robert. Todd?
My question is for Gene and Mike. I think for those of us that have been very focused on accountability, the biggest concern with the waiver process is that the lowest common denominator wins. If the department approves waivers that are that do water down accountability in specific states. So what type of communication are you having with the department to make sure their process is as rigorous as possible and that we don't repeat some of the errors of our ways in the way they do scoring, or not scoring is not the right term, but in the way they do their reviews of the applications?
Yeah, first, we are working hard to remove the requests that are on the table right now. That is, please give us a freeze on our progression of accountability, give us some relief right now. We think that's a non-productive exercise. We understand that the districts are concerned about this, that the pressures are growing, but it doesn't do anything to continue the growth toward accountability. So what we're talking to states about is how do you begin to formulate new systems that hold to high stakes accountability and reporting? Our conversations with the department, I think they understand that. What we don't want them to do, though, is prescribe exactly what those elements are and what kind of timelines that we would have for reporting against them and what kinds of conditions states would have to meet to do so. If they lay that out in front of us very clearly that you're going to have these high standards, it's going to have to be defended, then we have also talked to them about a peer review process. That's very different than what we've had in place in the past. First, very representative, but also getting to a point where a state and the feds can agree on a situation, not a yes-no kind of an environment. And in that kind of a context, I think we'd be willing to live by judgment by the Secretary about whether he thinks we are defending our proposals or not. Not whether we fit his model or not, but that whether he's willing to release federal monies. It is federal money, it is state money, being distributed by states, back through the federal government, to those states under a condition that we're giving them enough assurance, that we're rigorous in our approach, that we're going to be held accountable, and that we're going to in a straightforward way do something about the situation. That's the kind of contractual relationship we're trying to get with him, and I think we're getting close. Yeah.
Mike, been having similar conversations?
Not on this one, no. Any conversation we have is, stop talking about the Common Core, people! You're killing us! Just sip it!
Yeah, we've asked that in our state too. In reference to the Common Core, and how we met these things.
Look, I just hope we, in terms of not making mistakes again, I mean, I understand the concern about watering down accountability, but again, if you go back to the federal role, the federal government is not going to be very good at making nuanced decisions. It's just the nature of these things. And so I think the question is not so much, are we letting some state off the hook? I hope the question is more, are we giving these leading states a way to cut the strings and go forward and show what can be done? And then transparency, transparency, transparency. If there are bad actors out there, let's shine a spotlight on them. I mean, what does it mean now? What can the federal government really do if a state has weak accountability right now? Nothing. So let's not pretend otherwise.
Thank you. Martha, last question?
Yes, last question. And it's probably for Jean, but for any of the panelists. I think what you all have just said prompts me to ask, in any way that you can, have you considered trying to influence Secretary Duncan and the team just about not being so restrictive about this template? The template idea bothers me. I think, and it bothers those of us who have worked over the 18 months we have in our state developing, our alternative to NCLB. So we'd love to keep that thing as open-ended so that we can come out of the box. So have you talked to them about if they're going to do a template to keep it very open-ended?
Only about every other day.
That's what we want to hear.
The question is,
How's it going?
how's it going?
Mike, I might say from Colorado's perspective, I've had a discussion, it's been about a month ago with the Secretary on this matter, and I think he's reached out to several chiefs, but we also have a concern, the more you tack on to this request, the more it may present a problematic nature for a state. I suspect many of the things that will be added are the things we are doing, but the more I think he gets into a stance of people think that he's overreaching, the more problematic it will become for us.
Thank you. Well, in one sense, the conclusion of this session is going to come over the next couple of months as we find out more about, or weeks, as we find out more about what the department's requirements are, and as we find out more about the fate of the kinds of waiver requests we've just heard. So on that point, what I would say is good luck to Oklahoma, good luck to Colorado, and good luck to the other states that are trying to really innovate in accountability in ways that will advance the agenda. We are at the conclusion not only of this session, but the conclusion of the annual ADP leadership team meeting. I want to thank all of the participants who are here for your time, for your commitment, not just to this meeting, but to the work that you were doing back in your states. For those of us at Achieve, we are thrilled to have the opportunity to work with you, to support your efforts, to learn from and help others learn from your efforts, and we look forward to continuing to do that. We've gotten lots of good feedback, anecdotally and individual comments about this meeting. I'd like to encourage you to fill out the evaluation and feedback form so that we can get that more systematically and take that into account as we plan next year's annual meeting. Planning for that will begin in about 2 days. Not really. But I'd also like you to do just one other thing. This meeting took an awful lot of effort to put on. It took an awful lot of time and an awful lot of thought and an awful lot of work from what turns out to be an awful lot of people. Alyssa Peltzman, who I think you have all met, has just led our effort to do this and has done a superb job. So please join me in thanking her, but I'd also... But this has been a team effort by the entire Achieve staff, which is bigger now than it used to be because we have a whole bunch of people who are not only supporting your efforts, but supporting Parks as well. So I'd like the Achieve staff to stand and just recognize them and thank them. Then finally, I'd just like to say thank you again for being here. For those of you who are involved in the Park Institute, that starts at 3 o'clock. If you haven't registered yet, you can register outside. We will be convening back here at 3. For the rest of you, safe travels and Godspeed, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.